Welcome to Vespers. We're so glad that you have joined us again this evening, a chance when we can gather together and remember that we are not alone. Tonight we're going to begin like we do every evening, lighting this candle and remembering the presence of Christ in us, among us, and beyond us, remembering all those in our faith community who need our prayers this evening, and all those in the wider community beyond us as well, who need our prayers this evening as well. Thanks so much for being here and for being the wonderful community of faith gathered together to support and care for one another in these interesting and strange times that we find ourselves in. Well, tonight we have the opportunity to talk with Dennis Johnson. Dennis and Holly have been at Central since 2016, and after spending years in ministry in the Chicago metro area and also in Charleston, West Virginia, and Dennis has written a book, To Live in God, which are reflections from Walter Rauschenbusch. And so we took time to talk a little bit about Rauschenbusch, about his book. And the conversation was so good, it went on for a while. So I had to cut a few things out here and there. One of the things I want to make sure that we that you know about is that Dennis also is doing some Zoom meetings with the Berkeley School of Theology and the American Baptist Pastors of Northern California on Thursdays, one Thursday a month. They just did one last week. They'll do another one in November and December as well. We'll put links to all of those on our website at church, so you'll be able to find those and go and join in some discussion and learn and explore a little more about Walter Rauschenbusch, who is just incredibly interesting. But rather than spoil it, I'll just let us get into the conversation and talk about that. Before we go to that, though, let me remind you all that on Sunday, I believe we just remembered it was time change. So don't forget to set you don't have to say that anymore, do you? Your cell phone will do it for you. But don't forget the time changes. And also on Sunday, we'll be celebrating All Saints' Day, and we will have communion together as well. So make sure and gather up your saltines and your orange juice or whatever else you want for communion on Sunday. But now let's go and let's talk with Dennis Johnson. Hey Dennis, how are you doing?
I'm great, Aaron. How are you doing tonight?
I'm good. It's so good to see you and get to talk with you, since we haven't gotten to see each other for quite a while now.
I know it's just been, I'm not even sure when the last time you were in worship. It seems like a long time ago, just too long ago, and maybe longer still before it happens.
Well, that is true, but I'm glad that we can still stay connected in these ways too, as well. So, can you tell us a little bit about how things are going for you and Holly, and what you all have been up to lately in the midst of global pandemic?
Well, we've been trying to stay healthy, as everybody else has, and we're very vigilant about that and trying to stay masked and social distanced and avoid crowds. We haven't even had our daughter and son-in-law over for dinner or anything, so excuse me, we're just very careful, and hopefully everybody is doing the same thing. But we walk twice a day, try to get our steps in outside and fresh air. And we live in a townhouse that has 3 stories, and so we get our exercise in the house as well, which is good. We thought when we retired and came to Lexington, we'd probably get a 1-story retirement home, but we ended up with 3 stories. But it's really healthier for us because we do a lot of movement around the place as well. So, but we're trying to keep active and stay healthy and keep sharp and read and contact friends. And I do jigsaw puzzles in the winter, in the cold months. So I haven't quite got them out yet, but I've always liked to do puzzles for some reason. I'm sure there's some analyst who would dig into that and help me understand it better. But,
I'm not the
anyway.
therapist, but I'm married to one, so we can let her weigh in on that later.
Thank you.
We do the puzzle thing though too, and when we get out, we become obsessed for a short amount of time with this puzzle, and it's like we can't leave it, and then we'll put them up for a little bit, and we'll get them back out again and become obsessed all over again. So yeah.
Yes, that helps. That's helped me anyway, and but that's what we're doing these days. And
well, tell us a little bit about how you made it to Lexington, and maybe give us a little snapshot of your journey along the way.
Sure. Well, Holly and I are natives of Illinois. I grew up in rural Western Illinois, and Holly grew up in Chicago. We met during my seminary days at Northern Baptist Seminary. And I was on staff at a church in the western suburbs where her family attended, and we just clicked and were married. Actually, it was the Western Springs Baptist Church, which is the only church Billy Graham ever pastored.
Really?
Or he tried to pastor. They actually said to him, "It's time to move on, Billy. You're an evangelist, not a pastor." So. But that was a church, and his ghost walked those hallways as real as anybody else walked the hallways, believe me.
Yeah.
But so it was a great church, very creative congregation, very artsy. When I knew it, I don't know what it was like at the beginning when Graham was the pastor. But we met there, married there, then pastored in Chicago for 20 years. Then made our way to Charleston, West Virginia, to pastor what I thought might be 5, 7, maybe 10 years. Ended up being 20 years in Charleston, and then retired from there. And we knew we were not going to stay in Charleston in retirement. So our daughter and son-in-law live in Harrodsburg, and so we knew we would be relocating to Lexington once retirement came. So I retired in 2015. In November, the following July, we bought a townhouse here in town and relocated to Lexington, and love it as our adopted hometown, and love the community. And what brought me to Central, I think I've shared the story before, is I knew that Central, as the original organ of Baptist Temple from 1925. When they built the sanctuary in Charleston in 1925, the third building they've been in, they had a new Skinner organ built for that sanctuary. In the 60s, they sold it to a family in Michigan, who then eventually sold it to Central Baptist Church of Lexington and had it installed. In the previous building of Central, and then relocated to our current building. So I said to Holly one Sunday morning, "Let's go hear the old organ," and I know that it's been expanded, modified to the current Central building, but I knew of that link to Central from Baptist Temple long before we even contemplated coming to live in Lexington.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
The bringing together by musical instrument over the ages.
Yes.
I wonder what that the family who purchased that organ, what they had done with it. Is that
I don't know.
Where do you put an organ of that magnitude?
I know. They probably just put it in the store. Yeah. I don't know. But I think we were able to get that story, that link between Baptist Temple and Central Baptist. I never have documented the story, but the archives at Baptist Temple are fabulous. And so all of this is there in the archives, the story. And that's where I dug it out and found it. But I don't know what life was like for the organ up in Michigan.
That is great. Well, we'll have to connect Pat Ingram, who's doing our archives, with that story too. So maybe we can find some linkages between those and get the full story.
Well, someday I would love. I never have talked with Mark about this or Raleigh, but to have the organist who was with me for nearly 20 years come to Lexington and do something with the organ at Central. He would love to sit at the original console and play it, do something with it. So anyway. That's
wonderful. Well, I'm so glad that you all made it to Central, and we've had a chance to connect and get to meet you all after such a long career in ministry, both in the Chicago area, right, and then in West Virginia as well. So so you find yourself in West Virginia, I imagine, being at an American Baptist church, in the midst of a surrounding maybe culture politically that might be different than where your congregation fits in.
Yes, very different. The Baptist Temple is a very unique congregation. It's in the city, for example, and Charleston, of course, is the state capital, but it's about the only urban ministry, the whole state of American Baptist churches, and there are about 400 or 500 American Baptist churches in West Virginia. It's the only really urban ministry that goes on in the American Baptist Convention of West Virginia. But it has a history of being very socially engaged. In fact, one of my predecessors, Kyle Hazelton, who was there in the late 50s, early 60s, wrote one of the, really, I think probably the first book on racial justice. And he was a native of South Carolina, as a Baptist pastor. Kyle Hazelton came there, late 50s, wrote this book on racial justice in 1958. And it was unheard of.
Yeah.
Gave the Rauschenbusch lectures at Colgate Rochester Divinity School on racial justice. Then he followed that up with the second volume, Mandate for White Christians. And Martin Luther King wrote the preface for that book. And that's, for me, was always sort of an image of the ethos of Baptist Temple. Wasn't always as true, perhaps, and not everybody liked what their pastor said then, or with me either, probably, but it was unique as a congregation in mission, in relationship to many other American Baptist churches in West Virginia.
Yeah. Oh, well, that is really interesting, and it brings us a little closer here to our topic of the day, as we talk a little bit about Walter Rauschenbusch too, which you've done a lot of study on, written a book on, with devotions from his own words, and a great introduction, which brings this person we know of. And that I encountered in seminary as being about the social gospel. But I really love how you you highlight from the get-go this, I guess maybe the essential kind of interactivity between the inner life and then this outward social action that happens, which is something that's kind of hard to get to, and it seems like I tend to go into more of a dichotomous kind of, it's going to be this or this is better than that. But there was this really interesting integration. So I'd love to hear a little bit. Can you give us a little kind of, overview of Rauschenbusch and who he is and kind of maybe how you encountered him first?
Well, I was doing work on my Doctor of Ministry almost 40 years ago. And one of the pieces that I needed to put in place was a historical foundation as part of the theological foundation something out of our Baptist heritage and history. And my work was on spiritual formation, was my focus for the D-Min. And I went looking and I thought, who is going to help me, find a path in spiritual formation from our Baptist heritage? And I said, let me try Rauschenbusch. Well, the more I read, the more I thought, oh my goodness, this is revolutionary. And it was, of course, more so at that time than we may read him to be in our own time. But that was 40 years ago. I came upon him and just began to read everything that I could get my hands on. And I don't think this book will come about any sooner than it did. Just a year ago. It's like it had to age, it had to distill, over a period of time before it could come out. But I really read Rauschenbusch and began to see that he was talking about this, not just the social justice issue, social salvation, but where does that come from? It came from his deep devotion and commitment and communion with God. And that was at a time when, of course, all of it was for Baptists, individualistic.
Yeah.
Get the soul saved for heaven, and that's the end of it. And he said, really, that is not who Jesus was. It's not who he is. And he really said, I just read the other day something else that he wrote. I mean, I'm still reading Rauschenbusch, but he said, what we believe about the Bible is only what we've been taught. And that's true. So he said, I need to read it for myself. And the more he began to read the Gospels, he began to see this Jesus very different than what he had been taught about Jesus. He was a pastor in New York City from 1887 to 1897. And it was in the worst community of the city, Hell's Kitchen. Crime, prostitution, disease-infested tenements. And that was his ministry setting. And that's where he began to see that there was more to be saved than souls. So he began to speak to me about this inward journey, this outward journey of service, but also about in God we are all connected, that there is a solidarity in the human family, which again, the individualistic gospel folks were not affirming, human solidarity. So that's when I began to see all these pieces kind of the puzzle falling into three aspects: the inward journey of solitude, the outward journey of service, and the common journey of solidarity. And they're not three separate journeys, they're just three aspects of what it means to love God and love all of God's creation, including everybody who comes onto our path, whoever they are.
Yeah.
That's where I put the book together in those kind of segments, but it's all one journey of living in God.
Yeah. It's beautiful to think about, and really is something that I had not realized, from my cursory, understanding of Rauschenbusch and what Rauschenbusch's work, and this interesting depth and interest in mysticism, even that comes out in places that were unexpected, especially for his time. He seems like so far ahead than what I would have expected at all. So
I think so. I think it was out of a need that he had, as well as a need for the gospel to be holistically proclaimed. And I think that's where he had a mysticism, and he also had what he called an anthropocentric mysticism, one that is not detached from the world, but very much engaged in the world with people, a human-centered mysticism as well. So for over a century ago, he really, for Baptists, was a huge trailblazer in terms of spirituality.
Yeah.
And I think it came when he was a pastor in New York in 1886. He was a bachelor, which might account for some of the freedom that he had to do this. But he would meet every Sunday afternoon with two other local Baptist pastors. And they committed themselves to reflect together, to practice spiritual disciplines, contemplation, prayer. They read the classics of Christian spirituality, Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ, Jesuit spirituality, Loyola, and then they would end with communion every Sunday afternoon. And they obviously were familiar with Jesuit spirituality because they refer to themselves as a little society of Jesus.
Really?
In the Jesuit tradition. And that's where so they would criticize one another, they would strategize together on how they could make a difference in their community, and they practiced spiritual disciplines together. I think that really cultivated this desire to share that with others. And when he left the pastorate in 1897, he went to join the faculty at Rochester Theological Seminary. And one of the first sermons he gave to the students was on cultivating the spiritual life. And he adapted it into an article about the culture of the spiritual life. Of all things he could have told seminarians, the first thing he said was do this, which then led to the social engagement in ministry.
Yes.
So I find him a great model.
That really is a beautiful reminder, and kind of the. So often I feel like the pressure to we just get out there and do something, which I'm not saying is necessarily wrong. I probably sit around and think too much, but but also there's this the kind of slow working in of something that could happen slowly. The slow cultivation of identity is something that we can forget about oftentimes.
Do you have the book with you?
I do. Yeah.
If you would look at page 2, it's the first devotion in the book. Page 2, Holiness of Life. And about halfway through that paragraph, if you could read a sentence that comes after we do much.
Yeah.
See that sentence?
Yeah. We do much for God, but we do not rest much in God.
Yeah. I think that's true of pastors and parishioners, and particularly social activist congregations. I have a friend who's a retired pastor in Chapel Hill. And he didn't have the books, so he said, I don't have the book, Dennis, but I want to get one. I said, Jim, I'll send you a copy. And he started using it, and he called back and said, Dennis, what's really speaking to me, and it was a very social activist congregation that he served, is that first part, the inward journey. He said, I haven't had a personal devotional life since I retired. And he's been retired longer than I have. And he said this has gotten him back into that. But he said he was so empty that he needed that inner life again, kind of thing.
Yeah, sometimes we feel guilty.
I think that's, for me, that's, yes.
Yeah, I feel guilty for that. I feel guilty for everything. Not doing enough for other people. Not doing the inward work either. Enough. But we feel guilty for that and think we ought to be doing this or that. But this really is. There's a balance in here. And actually, I was going to ask you about this because holiness for me is one of those. It's like I don't want to say triggering because that's loaded, but it's a triggering word because kind of growing up with that holiness. I think there's some perfectionistic tendencies that go along in there with that. I'd really love to hear a little bit about what you think about Rauschenbusch's thoughts on holiness. Even though, I mean, he says here, holiness is goodness on fire, but
Yes.
I'd love to hear, like, what is that? I mean, that's a wonderful image, but what do you think that means for Rauschenbusch, and what are his thoughts on holiness?
Well, Rauschenbusch came out of 7 generations of pastors, German pastors, Lutherans. His father immigrated to the States as a German Lutheran missionary to the German community, and then he converted to becoming a Baptist. And so Walter Rauschenbusch followed his father's example. But he was steeped in the holiness tradition, the pietist tradition. And he never abandoned it, but I think he went beyond it. But I think he means that holiness is to live in the image of Christ, to be Christ-like. It's not moral perfection, it's Christ-likeness. And he said the only true worship of God is a Christ-like life, meaning compassionate, merciful, caring for the poor and the marginalized. To live a Christ-like life is the holy life. But I think it was taken and distorted somewhere along the line to be something other than that. It's more of your personal virtues and morals, and the perfectionism. Rauschenbusch says, it's a Christ-like life is what goodness on fire looks like. It's like Christ.
Yeah, which has this intrinsic connection to others, and
Yes.
And compassion, which is not what I like. In seminary, I had Dr. Henson. He came out of retirement, I think, his second or third time to teach. Whenever I was going through seminary at BSK, and he. One of the things that he said often in my, history of, I think, church history classes is that Jesus came preaching a message of compassion over and against the Pharisees' message of holiness. So much so that phrase is stuck in my head. Sorry, Dr. Henson, if I've gotten it wrong, but that was the idea. But this said, what you were just saying kind of almost connects both of those, the holiness and the compassion.
Yeah, I think the holiness tradition has a stereotype to it, which probably does have a fair representation, like the Pharisees' holiness tradition. But Rauschenbusch incorporated that, or sort of redefined that, reoriented it to Jesus. In your book, the last, I put as the last prayer in the book, Rauschenbusch's prayer that he included in his prayer book, Prayers of the Social Awakening. And that's the last sentence of the book is, for me, who Rauschenbusch is. Pardon the frailty of thy servant, and look upon him only as he sinks his life in Jesus, his master and savior. That's holiness for Rauschenbusch, to sink your life in Jesus as master and savior, and to live that out from inward outward in union with others. But that image, I think, for me, is what Rauschenbusch, as one who sinks his life in Jesus, not in a pious, syrupy, superficial kind of way that turns me off, but in a profoundly deep and transforming way, to sink your life in Jesus.
That is a beautiful image to me, because one of the things that I tend to wrestle with, I think, in the theology that I inherited, is it tends toward an annihilation of the self in some instances, not as union with all, but instead of as, total death to the self, and instead the Christ being there. And this doesn't seem to speak to that. It's a different image.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think the image of Rauschenbusch said when he was a pastor that there were three guiding principles that he saw in Jesus. Jesus' compassion for the poor, and his solidarity with all the human family, and the need to realize the reign of God, the kingdom of God, and how to help his people who were just devastated in the poverty of Hell's Kitchen. He said it haunted him. How can I help my people in the name of Christ? So for me, I think that's where he really embraces the best of what we as Baptists can offer and should be offering, but and he kind of shatters a lot of the stereotypes, not only of himself, but of so much of Christian tradition, and strips away some of the. And he was a professor of church history, so he knew the history, and he knew what had to be stripped away to get to the of the gospel.
One of the other ideas that you brought up that I was wanting to talk a little bit about more was can you maybe tease out and explain a little bit the concept of anthropocentric mysticism, because that's a beautiful. I know there's actually there's one of the days is entitled about that here in the book too. Okay. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and maybe an explanation of Rauschenbusch's views on that.
Well, he was drawn to mysticism in that classic sense of mystics, that God's presence, the divine, is mediated through tangible forms. But he said any mysticism which detaches itself from humankind is not Christ-like mysticism. That it must be centered also not only in God, but overlapped with human beings. That you can't separate God and humans. So there's a theocentric mysticism and an anthropocentric mysticism that are inseparable. But so he was very much resistant of monasticism, which he understood in his time as cutting off from the world.
Right.
He said, no, that's not consistent with Jesus, who went away to pray alone, but then entered the world. So I think he's talking about anything that any union with God through Christ and the Spirit, which separates us, makes us indifferent to human pain and suffering, is blasphemous. It's idolatry for him.
Yeah. Wow. That's another. I love how he is so difficult to tease out, because all of these things are intertwined. It feels very postmodern in a sense of this. We're holding these two seemingly paradoxical concepts at the same time in hand, and a beautiful. He's pushing me toward radical acceptance.
Well, he so many of the popular writers on spirituality, Thomas Merton, Henry Nouwen, contemporary, Rauschenbusch was saying the same thing a century ago.
Yeah.
just in language that was reflective of his setting in history.
That's the thing that gets me too, is because I read his language so often in here, and I hear I hear what I grew up with. You know, and so I'm automatically taken to a place that is not what he's saying. But this really helps to get past that and to see the real heart of what he means.
Well, and the editor and I talked about that. Do we bring all the language up to date in that sense, make it all inclusive language? And I said, these are the words he said. Now, any thoughtful, careful reader can convert them into current language. But so we kept with as much of the language. Now we did, rather than when men come to God, it was when people, or with men and women. So we modified some of the language. But I wanted to keep it as historically close to him as possible. And I have to tell you, Aaron, when I read his prayers and it's, "We beseech thee," I still like hearing "we beseech thee."
Yeah. I think it really works really well, because just from your introduction, you set it up so well as to his kind of overarching thought, his conceptualization of what it means to live in God. And you set it up so well that when I get to those points and I read those words, I'm then already able to see them in a new way, and to kind of have that framework to interpret them in, which is really helpful, because I think so often that happens, and so often what separates us today in our society sometimes is just our use of language, and we hear certain things and we're automatically triggered and we think we know what you mean. Underneath may be something different, and maybe a different heart beneath that.
Yes, I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right. It's good to be sensitive to the language. I taught language arts for 2 years after college. I was a teacher in public school, which is out of which I reaffirm my call to ministry.
Yeah.
So, but I love language, but I think sometimes, and I understand language like Rauschenbusch uses from a century ago can be a stumbling block. I understand that completely. I would just hope we can read Rauschenbusch beyond Rauschenbusch, in a sense. Read Rauschenbusch in our era, not get locked into his era, but listen to him talk, and then what does he have to say? But I hope people wouldn't get distracted with the language.
Well, like I said, I think it's set up in such a way that it really helps to get past that, and then to find some the beautiful nuance that's there in what he's saying. And I mean, his life as well expresses something much different than what we would expect. So it's beautiful to get to see the life that is lived out of this of these words too. You know, what. I wonder if you talk a little bit about, he speaks about capitalism or Christ, and that's something that's been in my thoughts of late, as I've heard arguments for one thing or another, and I thought this really has to do with, we're not talking about Jesus, we're talking about capitalism, and so what are some of his thoughts on economy and
I think there is the meditation on capitalism or Christ, and I think in that reflection he refers to comments that people make or justifications for greed in a capitalistic system. or scapegoating in a capitalistic system. He calls them lies dressed up as truth. That he was very concerned about systemic issues and not just, convert everybody and things will work out. He said, no, you can convert people and you still have corruption.
Yeah.
And, you've got to adapt and modify and sometimes totally change the system. He said, love is, you can draw well water out and take it to people in a village, but wouldn't love say, let's create a water system for the whole village, and kind of thing. He said that's what love does. Love your neighbor does. But he talks about things that are, when he saw capitalism being used as a shield for greed and corruption and suppressing people, keeping them in poverty so that some could have more, he said that's an unjust system. He wasn't saying throw it out. He was just saying, when he talks about Christianizing, his first book, I should say this, in 1907 was the most popular, Christianity and the Social Crisis. He went on sabbatical to Europe, this is 1907, and had every expectation of coming back to the seminary and being fired because of that book, particularly the last chapter. Well, he wasn't fired. His second book, 3 years later, wasn't a follow-up to that book. His second book was a book of prayers.
Wow.
And then a follow-up to that, 2 years later, was his book, another bestseller, Christianizing the Social Order. But by Christianizing the social order, he didn't mean, carving Christ into the Constitution. He didn't mean proselytizing and making everybody believe as he believed religiously. Christianizing meant humanizing, making compassionate the system, making compassionate America. Justice and solidarity for everybody was what he meant by Christianizing. Yeah. So he talks about that capitalism and Christ being to Christianize the economic system. It must be, I believe, if he came back today, if he saw the mess we're in today, one of the things he would say to us is that we must be a people that practices economic justice for all people. And that he gets into that devotion of capitalism or Christ and Christ. But that he was all about. It said America must be a country of economic justice. I think it would also say to us we have to be a people of all-inclusive love, without distinction. A people whose leadership is based on character, and they lead out of their character. People whose conduct follows their character. I think he would have a lot to say to us about our life today in America.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that Christianizing and compassion could be synonyms again. Yes. For what we would do with our world and our economy. So that's a beautiful sentiment to make our economics compassionate again.
Yes.
And a beautiful way to think about that. And once again, you have this really interesting, beautiful through line of my spiritual and social loving interaction with God, then flowing out into this loving interaction with people systemically and personally. Did you have maybe a prayer or something from Rauschenbusch that you'd like to share with us for this week?
I would. I thought this is 1910 book that Rauschenbusch, his second book, his Prayers of the Social Awakening. And I think if anybody wants to start reading more, start with his prayers. Start with Prayers of the Social Awakening. He said this is his favorite book. It wasn't his most important book, but he said it was his favorite book. And since this is the last Vesper service before election deadline, I thought I'd share this prayer that he wrote in 1910 for public officers, public leaders. O God, thou great governor of all the world, we pray thee for all who hold public office and power, for the life and welfare and the virtue of the people are in their hands, to make or to mar. We remember with shame that in the past the mighty have preyed on the labors of the poor, that they have laid nations in the dust by their oppression, and have thwarted the love and the prayers of thy servants. Strengthen the sense of duty in our political life. Grant that the servants of the state may feel ever more deeply that any diversion of their public powers for private ends is a betrayal of the country. Purge our cities and states and nation of the deep causes of corruption which have so often made sin profitable and uprightness hard. Bring to an end the stale days of party cunning. Breathe a new spirit into all our nation. Lift us from the dust and mire of the past, that we may gird ourselves for a new day's work. Give our leaders a new vision of the possible future of our country, and set their hearts on fire with large resolves. Raise up a new generation of public women and men who will have the faith and daring of the kingdom of God in their hearts, and who will enlist for life in a holy warfare for the freedom and rights of all the people.
Wow. That sounds like it was written this week.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Well,
party street. Yeah. So anyway, that's his prayer as we approach the deadline, not the voting day because it's been going on for quite a few days. The election deadline is next Tuesday.
Yeah. Well, those are heartening words to hear. That somebody so long ago senses the same things. I guess it's heartening. I don't know, but anyway, it feels heartening to hear someone else pray those words and express those same needs and the same hopes.
Yeah, I think he's saying never surrender, never give up your vision of a brighter day, of a better time ahead.
Yeah,
I think that's part of what he would say to us.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dennis, for sharing this with us. This has been a wonderful time. Great to get to talk with you, and great to get to hear about your book and all that you're continuing to do, and get inspiration from this Baptist forebear that make me proud to be Baptist.
Well, see, that's it. I'm out to rehabilitate the Baptist name.
Well, I think it's working here with this. Thank you.
Thank you for your good work and good ministry, also, Aaron.
Oh well, it's truly is a joy and a privilege to get to do this in the midst of a congregation that is ministering to me and helping to form me and really does such a wonderful job of lifting each other up. So grateful to be a part of this community in the midst of especially a time like this. So yeah. So thank you, and give our best to Holly as well. And
I will.
and all yours. And you stay safe out there. And we will hopefully get to see you before too long.
Okay. Be a good neighbor.
Okay, you too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Dennis. I so appreciate the time that you took to spend with us, to share with us about the life and the thought, the theology of Walter Rauschenbusch. If you'd like to find out more about this or hear more and have the opportunity to join in discussions, please check out our website where you will find some upcoming events. The next one on November 19th, where you can join in. It'll be a great way to get to experience that. You can find more links and everything else about Dennis's book as well. If you'd like to check that out as well, all on our website, and should also be in the description on the YouTube video here as well. Before we go, let's sing a song together. This week I need a little bit of peace, and this song brings that to me in droves. My shepherd will supply my need. My shepherd will supply my need. Jehovah is his name. In pastures fresh he makes me feed beside the living stream. He brings my wandering spirit back when I forsake his ways, and leads me for his mercy's sake, paths of truth and praise. The sure provisions of my God attend me all my days. Oh, may your house be my abode, and all my work be praise. There would I find a settled rest, while others go and come, no more a stranger or a guest, but like a child at home. Amen. Thank you all so much for being here with us this evening, and thanks so much again to you, Dennis, for taking time out to spend with us and for sharing all the wonderful things that you have learned and have written about. It really was a joy to get to talk with you, and I feel like I learned so much from our conversation, so thank you so much. And thank you all for being here with us this evening. We'll be back again on YouTube. We'll make sure the audio is working on Sunday, and at 11 o'clock as we celebrate All Saints Day, and as we also celebrate communion together. So gather up those elements that you'd like to use for communion as we separate, as we're separated, but we celebrate together, and we know that we are bound together by the Spirit of Christ. And we know also if you need something, please make sure and let us know. Keep in touch with us so that we can make sure and continue to be the body of Christ to each other, even as we're separated. Thank you so much again for being here this evening, and we will see you on Sunday. Go in peace.